Right. First of all, I just want to say thank you very much for coming to this talk. As we all know, suicide is a massive problem in this country, and the only way that this is going to change if people like you start taking an interest in this. It's such a big problem, we can't just leave this to the experts in terms of everything. We need everyone in the community to be aware of this. So before I start saying anything else, I just want to say thank you for coming here today. So my name is Michael Hempseed. Basically, I travel all over New Zealand running workshops on suicide prevention, mental illness and things like that. I talk to all sorts of different groups from, the Department of Corrections and Prisons, Fire and Emergency, you name it, I will talk to anyone that will listen about this topic. So a little bit about me. I love travelling. I've been all over the world. So from top left to bottom right, I've been to China, Morocco, Pisa, Rome. Down the bottom left there, that is the Chernobyl nuclear reactor. So in the unlikely event that the lights go out, I now glow in the dark and I will lead you to safety. Brazil and Cambodia. And I also like to do ever so slightly crazy things. I've piloted an aerobatic plane, jumped out of a perfectly good aeroplane at 13,000 feet, driven a Lamborghini around a racetrack in Las Vegas, and I've been hang gliding. So that's a little bit about me. I'm also the author of this book called Being a True Hero, Understanding and Preventing Suicide in Your Community. So this is the thing that I'm most passionate about. Right, so to start off with, I just want to look at this idea of where does mental illness fit within Christianity? The next few slides are sort of my ideas. I'm very happy to discuss this with you later. We could probably do a whole long talk just on these first few slides, but that's not the whole talk. So first of all, the words mental illness are not mentioned anywhere in the Bible. But if you read about some of the prophets, people like Job, Jeremiah, they had a pretty miserable time. And certainly some of their experiences seem to mimic what we would call mental illness today. Sometimes people think that, if you're a Christian, well, you don't need medicine, you don't need counselling or anything like that. However, what we do know is that Luke, the writer of Luke's Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, was a doctor. There's this passage here from Colossians, Luke, the beloved physician, greets you. So in nowhere in the Bible does Luke say, it was a mistake to be a physician and you should only rely on God. So nowhere in the New Testament is that found. So Luke seems to have travelled very closely with Paul, and Paul seems to have accepted that a regular physician can also help. However, sometimes people also think that, if you're a Christian, you shouldn't have mental illness. That's not necessarily the case either. We know that Paul writes about having the thorn in his flesh. Now, we don't know precisely what this thorn was, but there was some problem that he had, and so even though he was this very holy person, he still had some troubles. And so we need to get away from this idea that, if you've got mental illness, that means that you're not a good Christian or something like that. That's not the case at all. Finally, we're actually called to help people with mental illness. I think if Christ was alive today, we don't have too many people with leprosy, at least in New Zealand. I think Christ would spend time with those with mental illness today. I think by far that is the biggest need. I'll tell you a little bit why I think that in a minute. So that's sort of my, intro to sort of some of the Christian ideas in this. I started my book with this quote. It's from Fred Hollows. He was a doctor who dedicated his life to helping people in the Pacific. And the quote is, "I believe the basic attribute of mankind is to look after one another." And I think as Christians, that's what we're called to do. We're called to take care of those who are most vulnerable in society. And often those are people with mental illness or who are suicidal. So, I know it's a Saturday afternoon, but I've got a quiz for you. Don't worry, there's no punishment if you get the wrong answers. Try and work out what might be wrong with the people in the following photos. Yes, as C.S. Lewis would say, he has hit the wrong nail. Correct. What about this guy here? Headache, yes, there's also an arrow through his head, yep, absolutely. And I would have also accepted terrible choice of Halloween costume. Both answers are fine. And what about this person here? Broken leg, yep, been in some sort of accident. So far we have 3 for 3, well done. What about this one here? Getting old? Not sure. Okay, we'll move on. Okay, we'll come back to that one. Any ideas what's up with here? False smile. Okay, and this one here. Sad? Yeah. So I have shown these images to thousands and thousands of people all over New Zealand. You don't need to have any sort of medical training to know that the first 3 people have a physical illness. Very easy to see. The one on the bottom left there, that's the astronaut Buzz Aldrin. He was the second man to walk on the moon, and he suffered from depression for a large part of his life. Now, we don't know. Maybe he's depressed because he wasn't the first man to walk on the moon. We'll never know. The one at the bottom middle, maybe? The one in the bottom middle there is the actress Olivia Munn. She's been in films like Iron Man 2, and she's had anxiety for a large part of her life. And the one on the bottom right there, has anyone seen the film A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe in it? Yeah. So it's about a Nobel Prize winning economist. In the film, he sees people that aren't really there. In real life, he heard voices that weren't there. He had schizophrenia. So the point is, when someone has a physical illness like a broken leg, we tend to say they're sick. And we tend to give them a lot of sympathy. But sometimes when people have a mental illness, we treat it a little bit differently. We say things like, they're just seeking attention. They just need to drink some concrete and harden up. Well, we've now got some pretty fancy science that can actually see inside the human brain, and we've discovered that mental illness is not imaginary. There are very significant changes that happen in the brain when someone develops a mental illness. So the part of the brain that's circled there is called the hippocampus, not the hippopotamus. Trust me, you do not have a hippopotamus in your head, it would not fit. But the hippocampus is the part of the brain that is responsible for memory and emotion. And researchers have found that part of the brain can shrink by up to 17%. So there are very real and very significant changes in the brain. Sorry, at the back there? Yeah, that's the good news, that if people do get better, this isn't permanent. It's not just the hippocampus, there's another part of the brain called the hypothalamus. And if you're thinking I'm deliberately doing this to confuse you, hippocampus, hypothalamus, no, I'm not. But the hypothalamus, this is a part of the brain that, amongst other things, regulates stress. And we've found that if someone without depression has a really bad day at work, a very stressful day, they can go home and that stress switches off and they can relax. But someone with the illness depression, that doesn't switch off. So people feel stressed all the time. You could be lying on a beach in Hawaii, no problems at all, and if you've got the illness depression, still feel stressed. So we know that there are very real and very significant changes that happen in the brain when someone develops the illness depression. Okay, I've done enough talking for a couple of minutes. Just for the people around you, out of these 3 examples here, Fred, Sarah and Lucy, which ones do you think might have signs of depression? And which ones do you think might have signs of something else? Talk to the people around you for a couple of minutes. Okay. Who thinks that Fred, who feels low every couple of weeks, has signs of the illness depression? Yes. A few people do. He has an extremely serious medical condition. It's called life. So what we need to understand is that we don't want to pathologise or turn into an illness all normal human behaviour. So it is normal to have days where you feel good, it's normal to have days where you don't feel quite as good as others. That is not the illness depression. If we made that depression, everyone on the planet would have it. Sarah, she's just lost her grandmother. It's called grief, yeah. Grief is not a mental illness. It's considered a normal reaction to something difficult or tragic that's happened in the person's life. However, there is something called prolonged grief, where if in some situations the person gets stuck in that grief and there's no change, then it can become a mental illness. And finally, Lucy. She has a wonderful life. She has a great and supportive family, great boyfriend, and a great job. Yet most days she feels totally worthless, doesn't want to get out of bed, finds nothing makes her happy, and doesn't see the point anymore. That's the illness depression. Yeah. Now, what would happen if you said to Lucy, "What have you got to be depressed about? You've got the perfect life." And make her feel worse, yeah. We don't fully know exactly what causes depression, but sometimes people seem to have a really good life. Even Christians that seem to be really in love with God, for some reason still develop this. We don't entirely know why that is. When you think about the illness depression, we often think about people feeling down, but actually a lot of people don't feel sadness, they actually feel numbness, so they don't feel anything at all. There's some or all of these things that people might have. People can just feel totally worthless. They don't have the energy for anything. So even something as simple as getting up and making a bowl of cereal in the morning, if you've got the illness depression, people don't have the energy for it. It becomes like running a marathon for people. So all the energy has been drained out of them. People either have in or hypersomnia. They want to sleep all the time or don't sleep at all. And people lose all enjoyment in life. So for example, if they like spending time with friends, if you develop the illness depression, suddenly nothing makes you happy anymore. The other one that we don't talk about too much is that depression affects your ability to think and concentrate. So most people, when they go to the breakfast aisle at the supermarket, how long does it take them to choose a breakfast cereal? Yeah, usually a minute or so. It's usually a pretty simple decision. If you add the illness depression into that, how long does that simple decision take? Yeah, a long time, for 20, 30 minutes sometimes. So that really simple decision seems absolutely overwhelming. Now, we often say to people with depression, if you're feeling depressed or suicidal, you should talk to someone. But if you're having trouble thinking about even simple things like this, sometimes you actually can't talk to people because you don't realise what's happening. So instead of having what I call the personal responsibility model, where we say it's your job to speak up, we need the caring community model. So in other words, if you notice that someone's struggling, any of these warning signs that I'll talk about in a minute, then you should talk to that person. Yeah. Now, I know some people do indecisive when they go shopping. For example, my wife, when she goes shoe shopping, she likes to take all day. She doesn't have depression, she is just indecisive. So there's a bit of a proviso with that one. There we are. Yeah. The other thing with depression is it's not just emotional, it can be very physical for a lot of people. So the reason is your brain and your body are not disconnected. Your brain and your body are connected. And so what we're starting to find is that, if someone has, say, a headache, does that mean their head feels terrible and the rest of their body feels fine? Not usually. Usually the rest of their body doesn't feel so well either. And so we're starting to find out that in a lot of cases, mental illness can actually cause a lot of physical pain for people. Now, I'm not saying all things like back pain are the result of mental illness. If you fall off a roof, there'll be another explanation for it. But for some people, we now think that depression doesn't just make you feel miserable or numb, it actually causes you physical pain all over your body. So we can start to see why this has such a big impact. With all the things that I've just talked about, the World Health Organization has said that depression, this one mental illness, is the leading cause of disability worldwide. Yeah, wow. So this means that this one illness accounts for more time off work, more lost productivity, and more sick days than probably everything else. So it's a massive problem. Now, people ask, is mental illness actually increasing today, or are we just recognising it more? Both, yeah. We're certainly recognising it more, but we've had something called the Minnesota Personality Inventory. It's a questionnaire that we've given out to people since 1938. If you ask school students in the 1950s and 60s, what percentage wake up stressed and overwhelmed, what percentage do you think said yes? About 10 or 15%. So very, very low numbers. Today, if you ask the average high school student, about 75% say yes. This is scary, but psychologists have worked out that the average young person today is more stressed and more anxious than psychiatric patients were in the 50s and 60s. And the problem is, why the stuff's growing, is the modern world is too complex for the human brain. If you've got a smartphone, you get 1 million emails a day, and you've got Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, Instagram, all these things, the mental... yes, indeed. Yeah, there's very strong evidence that this is causing serious problems. I'll talk about things like sleep later on, but some of these things, the human brain is not designed for it, and this is why we're having so many people break down, unfortunately. The other thing about depression is it changes the way people think. And in terms of suicide, this is probably the most important factor, that even if someone is deeply loved by their family, people with the illness depression, they think, I'm a burden. No one loves me. And so we often think that people that commit suicide are very selfish, but sometimes they actually think, the world will be better off without me. So it's really important that we understand how much a person's thinking is altered by this, and in many cases, not all, but in many cases, they are not thinking clearly. Now, you might ask, where are all these depressed people? If you were to meet Robin Williams in the street, what would you think? He's a ghost. Correct! Yes. But when he was alive, you would think he was the happiest, most energetic and joyful person that you've ever met. We now know underneath that actually things weren't so good for him. So, and same with Angelina Jolie. Just because someone has a smile on their face doesn't necessarily mean they're always happy. Sometimes people cover it up. Sometimes people don't know they have it. So it's important to look a bit deeper. Now, the other way that depression can come out for some people is through anger and irritability. Now, who here has had a bad day at work and you go to use the photocopier, you're running late for a meeting, and the Muppet in front of you has jammed it? And you might get a little bit angry. That's not a sign of depression, that's normal. But when the anger's ongoing and constant and people are always getting upset over little things, that could possibly be an indicator of depression. Now, in terms of young children, how do you think a lot of young children, if they do have mental illness, how do you think it often comes out? Yeah, tantrums, behavioural problems. And particularly with the earthquakes, a lot of my work is now actually with primary schools. And they're working with a lot of very violent and aggressive children. But, if you can't talk about what's going on for you and you've got all these negative emotions in you, people often become difficult children. Actually, they're not difficult, they often need help. So it's about looking a little bit deeper and seeing what's going on there. Maybe? There we are, yes. Now, as someone asked, the good news is that if you have depression, in most cases, you're not stuck with it for life. In most cases, it is treatable, and in most cases, people do get better. One of the big questions I always get when I do these talks are, do people ever get better? And yes, this is not a chronic or terminal illness. In fact, it's estimated that for half of all people with depression, they will have 1 or 2 episodes throughout their life and never have it again. Another maybe 20 to 30% might have 3 or 4 episodes. So actually, the majority of people can get better for this. I'll talk about how to find help. Now that I've taught you all this, does that mean you can go around diagnosing people with mental illnesses? No, I'll give you 2 examples of this. One comical example, one not so much. The first one is I used to be a youth worker and I had a young man come to see me one day and he said, my mother gave me a test on the internet to see if I was a psychopath and it turned out I was. I'm not normally speechless, but I didn't know what to say to that. Anyway, when I talked to him, it turned out he had depression and the mother had picked up the anger as a sign of being a psychopath. A more realistic example, though, is if someone's got a brain injury, in some cases the symptoms can look very similar to depression. So it's important that you get this checked out by a doctor or counsellor or someone like that. You can indeed. I'll come to that in a minute, yeah, but great question. Yeah, very, very important. Maybe? There we are. Okay, now I just want to talk about suicide for a little bit. So I think in order to understand suicide, the first thing that you have to understand is most human beings have this deeply ingrained will to survive. Most of us are very good at survival and it's hardwired into us. And if someone becomes suicidal, something has gone very wrong in that person's life. That most basic driver has been flipped on its head. So we need to understand something's gone really wrong in the person's life. Now, it doesn't mean to say that it's not fixable. It just means at the moment, something's not good. Now, if you ask Bob the builder here, can we fix this? One of the biggest things that we get told about suicide is, well, you can't do anything about this. But actually, there's lots of other fields we've made huge progress. Did you know in America, childhood obesity has dropped by almost 50% in the last decade? Did you know your odds of dying in a plane crash are 99% less than they were 30 years ago? Violent crime is going down. Remember that hole in the ozone layer that we were told by the year 2000 it'll be completely gone? By the year 2050, it'll be completely healed. So we can fix complex problems, and I see no reason why we can't solve the problem of suicide and drop our horrifically high rates that we have in New Zealand. So it can be done. Now, I've talked about the illness depression, and depression certainly plays a role in a lot of suicides. However, new research suggests that for a staggering number of them, a third to a half, they are the result of a same-day crisis. So the person was fine in the morning and then something went catastrophically wrong in their life, such as a relationship breakup, losing a lot of money, humiliation on social media, being fired from a job, something sudden and catastrophic. One study found that for half of all people that die by suicide, there was 10 minutes between them thinking about dying by suicide and carrying it out. So a heck of a lot of them are very, very quick and impulsive decisions.
That must make it very hard to
Prevent. Yes and no. I'll give you an example of this, a real life example. When I was a youth worker, a young girl came to see me. She had this dream of going to the Olympics. That was her big goal. The day before she came to see me, she got a rejection letter in the mail saying that her dream had gone up in smoke and she wasn't going to the Olympics. Without thinking, she immediately tried to end her life. Fortunately, she was unsuccessful, and 24 hours later she knew that would have been a tragic mistake. But it was that sudden impulsive decision that caused that. So it's really important that we know that some of these things can happen very, very quickly. However, the fact that there might have only been one thing on the surface, do you think maybe underlying it there were other things? Yeah, so possibly things like sleep deprivation, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But if you're really tired, you make poor decisions. Like I'm sure we've all have an example in our lives where we've been really tired and we do something stupid. So it's about trying to make sure that people don't get into bad situations in the first place. In many ways, I don't think suicide prevention should be about the last 5 minutes. I'd say it would have been almost impossible to try and intervene with that situation. That girl was home alone when she got that letter. It would have been very, very tough to do something. But she was 16. I would say you had 10 or 11 years to intervene in that. Why on earth was she in a situation where she thought her whole life was about one thing? Didn't anyone recognise that, hold on, if you lose this, you've got a serious problem here? So I think, although, yes, you're absolutely right, they're very difficult to stop in the immediate, I think long term, we can actually try and stop people being in bad situations. So some suicides do happen incredibly quickly, but there are others where there are more warning signs for. And so if ever you see any of these risk factors here, you need to talk to the person. I'll tell you how to do that in a minute. But some of the symptoms of suicide can be things like talking a lot about death, saying things like, there's no point anymore. Wouldn't suddenly getting better after a long history of depression, isn't that a good thing? The problem is, if they've been really depressed for a long period of time, they suddenly get better, often they've made a decision to end it, and they're very peaceful. So if you noticed a rapid change in someone like that, start asking questions. I'll teach you how to do that in a minute. This has come out in the last 10 years, what we call ruminative thoughts. People that can think around and around about the same negative situations and they get stuck in that. Giving away prized possessions, writing goodbye notes, significant negative changes or events such as a breakup, talking about wanting to die by suicide. But probably the best indicator is hopelessness. Now, do people go around saying they're hopeless? Not usually, but sometimes you've got to read between the lines of what people say. So they might say something like, if they get fired from a job, I'm never going to find another job again. Or if they experience a relationship breakup, I'm never going to find someone. So although they might not explicitly say they're hopeless, if you sort of read between the lines, then that might help. So if ever you recognise any of these warning signs or you think that there's something not quite right here, you should explicitly ask the person, are you planning to kill yourself? Now, I know that's a really scary thing to ask, but research does show that this can make a huge difference. Thomas Saywell, who wrote a testimonial for my book, I taught him this stuff about 3 years ago. He went home, he realised one of his flatmates had one of the warning signs I talked about. He explicitly asked him, "Are you planning to kill yourself?" And the flatmate said yes. So, a simple question like this can make a difference. Now, you probably don't want to say this out of the blue. What you probably want to say is something like what you've noticed. So, I've noticed that you don't seem to be yourself lately. Or the other day, you shouldn't wait a day, you just said to me now, you don't think you're ever going to find another relationship. You're going to be lonely for the rest of your life. I know this might be a really difficult question. Does this mean you're planning to kill yourself? Now, I've asked hundreds, if not thousands of people this question. How many people do you think have lied to me? No. Yeah, or just one. They didn't die by suicide, but I found out they lied later. The overwhelming majority of people will tell you the truth if you ask them this question. Because deep down, I don't think anyone actually wants to die. They just want some sort of solution to their problem. So don't be afraid to ask this question. I'll give you another example of this. One organisation I was working for, I got a call at about 11:30 at night. A woman rang me up and said, "Look, I don't want to live." I listened to her story and I went through everything that I could think of why she shouldn't die by suicide. I never run out of things to say, but that night I did. And I got to about 10 to midnight and I'd run out of things to say. I said, "Look, I don't know what to say, but your life has tremendous value. You'll be dead for billions and billions of years. Could you wait another 10 or 15 minutes? And she thought about it and she said yes. I had no idea what I was going to do. I didn't know where she was, so I couldn't call the police. Anyway, at the end of the 15 minutes, I said, "Do you still want to kill yourself?" She said no. And at first I thought she was just telling me what I wanted to hear. But she said, no, I really mean this. And she told me a whole lot of other stuff. Sometimes just a little bit of time is all it takes for people to reconsider. Because I think deep down people want to live. Sometimes just buying that little bit of time can make a big difference. Now, if ever someone says to you, we don't mind the no answer, do we? If someone says, "No, I don't want to kill myself," breathe, not a problem. But if they say yes, that scares a lot of people. And one of the simple things you can say is, "I'm so glad you told me that." Because what do you think it would be like to open up and admit that you're suicidal? Probably feel incredibly vulnerable, think, have I told the wrong person? Did I make a mistake? What have I done? How would you feel if you heard, "I'm so glad you told me that"? It would help you to relax. It'd be a fantastic thing to say. And some people are like, "Well, what if they cry in front of me?" Well, you get out the tissues and you sit with them. So what? It's not going to kill you. And just listen to people. Listening can really be helpful. And listening doesn't mean saying, "Oh, I know exactly what you're going through," or, "That's stupid to kill yourself," or anything like that. Just listen to their story. Often listening makes a huge, huge difference. Now, I can't talk you through this exactly, but basically you need to make sure the person is safe. Don't leave them alone. Now, in some rare cases, you might have to call the police on someone. So if you believe someone is about to die then and there, call the police. I've only ever had to do that 3 times in my life. How do you think they all reacted? Yeah, they weren't particularly happy with me. "You effing, I'm gonna..." Yeah. Anyway, one of them thanked me that night, one of them thanked me about a week later, and one of them thanked me a couple of months later. So actually long term, even if they're very angry at you at the time, they will be grateful. Most times you don't need to do that, but you do need to get the person some help. So that could be getting them to see their GP. Do you know the number 1737? Maybe getting them to ring that number. There's Youthline, Lifeline, but basically get them some help. And if for any reason the first person you go to doesn't help, go to the next one and the next one until you find someone that will. Now, some people think, isn't asking a bit of a dangerous thing to do? Couldn't that give ideas to people? Research is incredibly clear about this. If someone is not suicidal and you ask them, it will not give them suicidal thoughts. If someone is suicidal and you ask them, in some cases it has no impact on their suicidal thinking, or in most cases, it actually reduces it, because they're actually able to tell someone else about it. So don't be afraid to ask that question. And as I said, the person that wrote the testimonial for my book, asking that simple question probably saved someone's life. Maybe. There we are. Now, what do you think would happen if someone said they're suicidal and you said to them, would you like to see a psychiatrist? Would you like to see a psychologist? Would you like to see a psychotherapist? Would you like to see a counsellor? Would you like to see a CBT therapist, a DBT therapist, a person-centred therapist, a solutions-focused therapist, or a Gestalt therapist? What do you want? Yeah. And remember I said it was difficult choosing a breakfast cereal. Just don't overwhelm the person with too many options. Don't say, well, there's this place, there's this place, there's this place, there's this place. If it's all too confusing and it's all too overwhelming, I've started saying to people, go and see your GP. You should be able to get to a GP within a few hours in New Zealand, no matter where you are, and it's one place to go to. I've got nothing against counsellors, but why do you think I say a GP rather than a counsellor? Yeah. Unfortunately, it can be difficult finding a counsellor. I had to find someone for a person up north. I know what I'm doing. It took me about an hour to find the right person. And if you're really depressed, it can be very difficult to make a decision. So a GP should be like a gatekeeper. They should know about the different services. And they can assess the person whether they're low, moderate or high needs. But I've started saying to people, go see your GP if you're not sure where to go for help. And if for any reason they don't understand or they're not good, change GPs. Okay, now some people say, well, to get over a mental illness, all you need to do is exercise and eat well. And the slight problem is what they've done is they've confused the difference between maintaining good mental health and treating a mental illness. So, for example, if someone had asthma, absolutely, building up their fitness might reduce the chances of a future asthma attack. But if someone is gasping for air on the ground, having an asthma attack, do you say to them, just run around the block a couple of times, you'll be fine? No, but sometimes we do that with mental illness. So sometimes actually things like counselling, medication, therapy, sometimes these are the things that are actually needed to help people work through a mental illness. So why does counselling work? Well, if you're not sure, one of the problems with a lot of bad feelings is if you don't talk to someone, they can build up. And it's really easy to let something quite small become absolutely overwhelming for you when you keep it inside your head. A good counsellor should be able to maybe give you some perspective on this and say if you're, maybe if something goes wrong at work and your immediate temptation is to go home and drink and get really drunk, a good counsellor could give you some strategies to try and overcome that. So that's hopefully what counselling does. Now, what do you need to be in order for counselling to work? Alive? Yeah. You actually need to be quite well. If you are so depressed that you can't get out of bed, counselling is actually not going to work for you. So there are some people that are really unwell that actually need medication to help them out of that really bad situation that they're in. So medication can be really helpful for some people. Now people say, well, what if counselling and medication don't work? There are lots of other options. I'll just go through some of these. So there's art and drama therapy. So some people find either playing music, drawing, creating a sculpture, being involved in a play or a production. For some people, they find that really healing and therapeutic. Can be really good. Another one, this happened in Christchurch. There was a group of mainly retired men, and a lot of them had quite severe depression. And they thought, look, we don't really want to sit around in a group talking about what's going on for us. They thought, we're really practical, we're good with our hands. They went door knocking, and they said to people, if you've got any odd jobs that need doing around the house, we'll do the work for free. If there's any parts, you pay for that. What impact do you think that had on them? Oh yeah, absolutely massive. It gave them a sense of identity, gave them a sense of purpose, and they met some other people. So sometimes a group volunteering to do something really practical like that can be helpful. This is not the one on the bottom right, top right there. It's called transcranial magnetic stimulation. It uses very powerful magnets. It seems to reset the brains of people with chronic depression that's hard to treat. Now, a 10-session course of this is $5,000. I don't recommend this as the first try, but if nothing else works, it's an option that's there for people. There's something called play therapy. Now, this has traditionally been used with children. Say if there's a 5-year-old child and their brother or sister died, how do you process that as a child? Talking about it's quite difficult, but sometimes using toys and models to act it out, maybe putting their brother in a box in the ground to symbolise that they're gone. For some people that seems to be really helpful, and there's some evidence that this can also work with adults. Now, what about people that have been betrayed so much by people they don't trust anyone? If you've lost all trust in people, seeing a counsellor is not actually going to help you. So there's something called animal-assisted therapy, and basically learning how to look after a horse, a dog, or something like that can rebuild trust, and then that might be a bridge to more help. So the point is there's lots of options for help. And the final one is something called neurofeedback. Basically, you hook your brain up to something called an EEG machine, it reads your brain waves, and you can see your brain on screen. And this allows you to recognise what your brain is doing and respond to that. And that's been shown to be quite effective for some people. So the point is, if counselling and medication don't work, there are lots of other options. Now here's one that is questions we should definitely talk about more. Did you know that people that are more forgiving have less mental illness? Because what do you think happens if you hold on to anger, hatred and resentment? Yeah, it destroys you, it eats you up, it's catastrophic for our well-being. But secular research also says that people that are more forgiving live longer.
I forgive everyone.
Perfect. Yeah, live to be 100. So this, I'm deadly serious about this. We've got all these posters around town for eating well and exercising. We should have information about forgiveness. There are proven health benefits for it. And a lot of people say, well, I don't know how to forgive. Some people find writing a letter saying, I know you hurt me, you did this, this and this, but I forgive you could be really helpful. So teaching people practical skills around forgiveness can be really helpful. Now, you might ask, well, where do we find all this help? Well, has anyone heard of something called the Family Services Directory? Okay, basically this has a complete list of all the help and support organisations throughout New Zealand. It's estimated there are 5,000. In Christchurch, there's 700 to 900 different social services. So in other words, if you're in a bad situation, there will be someone somewhere that can help. Maybe the first person won't help, maybe the second person won't help, but keep on searching. I have said this to some people, and I mean this. If I have to take you to all 700 to 900 different social services before I can find you someone that can help, I would be willing to do that. The most I've ever had to take someone to is about 8 or 9. So I'm sure one day there'll be someone that's difficult and I have to go through several hundred, but it hasn't happened yet. But the point is there's a lot of help out there. And I recommend just spend 5 minutes looking through this, because you never know when you're going to meet someone in a bad situation. Now, what would happen if you asked about suicide and someone said, I will only tell you if you promise not to tell anyone else?
You have to be confidential until there's an immediate risk of harm.
Yeah, so if you believe someone's life is in danger, confidentiality goes out the window. Human life is the most precious gift we have. It is more important than confidentiality. So you could say something like, I won't tell anyone else unless I think you're in danger. I've only ever had to call the police on 3 people. Sure, they were angry at the time, but later, they thanked me. So don't worry about upsetting the person if you have to save their life. Human life is the most precious gift we have. Now, in terms of what can cause some of this stuff, there's a couple of points that I want to look at. One is childhood trauma, and one is sleep deprivation. There's no one cause of this stuff, but sadly this is stuff that we need to know about. So in 1998 in America, there was a huge study that was done called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And they asked about 17,500 average Americans about their history of childhood trauma, and then they asked them, obviously, things like mental health outcomes, and unsurprisingly, having a history of childhood trauma increased your chances of having mental illness. They also asked them about physical health outcomes, and they found that a history of childhood trauma increased your risk of physical health problems like cancer and heart attacks. The reason for this is, if you grow up in a really stressful environment as a child, your brain gets full of the chemical cortisol. The problem with the chemical cortisol is it suppresses your immune system. It's the fight or flight, faint or freeze response. And if you are being chased by a tiger and you've got the chance of staying alive and fighting off cancer in 50 or 60 years, or staying alive now, what do you think your brain puts all its energy into? Staying alive today. So cortisol suppresses your immune system. This is why childhood trauma has so many problems, unfortunately. Now, the good news is if people get treatment for this, like counselling and things like that, the negative effects go away. So it's not as though this has happened to you, there's no hope. There really is hope with this. One of the interesting things that we've found is that people that have experienced significant trauma, there's a part of the brain called Broca's area. That's the part of the brain responsible for speech and language. And we've found that if people have experienced significant trauma, this part of the brain doesn't work so well. So we say, talk about it. But actually, sometimes people can't talk about it. So that's where some of these other therapies that I talked about, play therapy, drama therapy, and things like that, it's another way to manage these emotions. If you want two absolutely brilliant books on this, the first one is The Body Keeps the Score. This is one of my favourite books of all time. I've read it twice and I want to read it again. But it talks about the impact that trauma has on the body. Now, that first study that I talked about, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, what percentage of the population do you think they found had one or more adverse childhood experience? They found a staggering 68%. So we used to think that childhood trauma was something that was very rare. Sadly, we know that it's much more common. And a staggering 1 out of every 8 people, or 12.5%, had 4 or more. And sadly, the way that this is usually, what's the way that this is usually treated in society? Prison is the treatment we often have for this stuff, unfortunately. So it's important that we look at some of the root causes of this stuff. The other book there is The Deepest Well by Nadine Burke-Harris. That talks about more the medical side of this. So there's several things that I think we could do about mental illness and suicide in this country, but the more people that understand about childhood trauma, the better. And what I said before, if someone ever tells you about childhood trauma, the first thing you should say is, I'm so glad you told me that.
What sort of things do you
Yeah.
do in childhood?
So the first study, they looked at 10 things. So physical, sexual, emotional abuse, neglect, if there was a parent that was incarcerated, if there was the death of a parent, so things like that. So significant negative events.
So divorce would be?
Yeah, it's a little bit complicated. In most cases, yes. If there's a really bad relationship where there's violence, in some cases divorce was positive because it stopped those negative situations. But in most cases, yes, separation wasn't a good thing. Yeah.
Living in a war zone being...
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I'll hold that thought for a second. I'll come back to that. Yep. There's something called vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. You don't just have to see trauma firsthand. Watching trauma on TV can give people the same effect of some of this stuff. Yeah, and what do we have today? We've got smartphones that blast us with all this negative news 24/7. Now, in terms of a war zone, there's a fascinating book called It Didn't Start With You. And not only can living in a war zone impact you, we now think that trauma can be transmitted from one generation to the next. There have been fascinating studies that have been done with rats. If you expose a rat to an electric shock and a negative smell, and then follow that rat for 3 generations, the 3rd generation will fear that negative smell, even if they've never been exposed to it before. And it sort of makes sense that if something killed a generation ago, you actually want that to be encoded in your DNA, because it tells you future generations will survive. So if you want my big answer to why do we have such high rates of mental illness today, I think we're still dealing with the after effects of World War II. Some studies suggest that a quarter of all fathers were killed in Europe. Can you imagine the impact that has had on the world? And so this is probably not just stuff today, but stuff that's going on now. In terms of the impact of war, in the Vietnam War, it was estimated about 55,000 US soldiers died in the war. Since then, it's been estimated that about 150,000 to 200,000 soldiers have died by suicide. So 3 to 4 times as many people as died in the war. So this is why we need to understand trauma and we need to treat this stuff. The good news is there is hope and we are getting much better at treating this stuff. I mean, even 30 years ago, if you went to a doctor and said, I've got PTSD, they'd have probably said, good luck to you. Now today they say there's this option, there's this option, there's this option. We are learning so much about this. So I think this is going to be the generation that will actually change this stuff. I mean, when you read the Bible, we read about leprosy. I mean, in most parts of the world, leprosy is a forgotten illness. There are still parts of the world where there's a bit of it, but in most cases, it's a forgotten illness. Maybe if we start getting good at treating some of this stuff, mental illness could be treated in a similar way. So I think there is actually some hope there. The next thing that I want to talk about is sleep. So I think childhood trauma is a significant cause of mental illness, not the only one. The other big one is sleep. Now, what happens if you don't get one night's good sleep? How do you feel the following day?
Not good.
Yeah, you're tired, you're grumpy. Everything seems worse, doesn't it? But what about chronic sleep loss? That's losing one night's not a disaster. We don't rush people off to the emergency room if they lose one night's poor sleep. But what really causes the harm is chronic or ongoing sleep loss. It's estimated that most suicides happen between 12 and 3 a.m. in the morning. And that's actually the time when you're most sleep deprived. And when you're sleep deprived, you don't think clearly. And I think one of the reasons a lot of suicides happen is people are in that sleep deprived phase, they're not thinking clearly. So the more that we can recognise about sleep, the better it is. Now, in terms of teenagers, there's some interesting things that have been found with teenagers. The teenage brain is quite different from the adult brain. Teenagers produce the chemical melatonin, which is the chemical that puts you to sleep, adults produce this at about 9, 10 or 11 o'clock at night. Teenagers produce this at 11, 12 or 1. So teenagers actually want to sleep later. They're not being difficult or defiant. Yeah. If you've ever had jet lag and been wide awake at 3 a.m. in the morning, are you being defiant or is your brain telling you, it's morning, wake up? And this is what a lot of teenagers experience. So we know there's been a really high rise in mental illness amongst teenagers. I think the fact that a lot of teenagers are really sleep deprived plays a big role in this. I might skip that one just for now. There's this fantastic book by Matthew Walker called Why We Sleep. And we used to think that sleep didn't do very much. We now know that every single process in the human body benefits from good sleep. As far as we know, there's not one process that sleep doesn't affect. And in terms of mental illness and suicide, there seems to be quite a strong correlation between lack of sleep and things like that and the rise in mental illness. Researchers point to a spike in mental illness about 2011 or 2013, which was when these things came out. And a lot of people say it's social media, but these things disrupt our sleep and they keep us awake at night. It's estimated that people are losing an hour's sleep on average, and that's significant. The way sleep works, unfortunately, is the last 1 to 2 hours of sleep are the most important. It's not the first hour, it's actually the last hours. And sadly, we wake most people up before they get to those really powerful healing stages of sleep. So sleep is absolutely vital. And I think the Bible knows this, on the seventh day, God rested. We are not meant to work 24/7. We need our rest. It's absolutely vital to us. So it's really, really important that we look at the impact of this. Now, a lot of people say, there's some people that have just got good sleep, but I've never had good sleep. I've had chronic insomnia my whole life. And a lot of people have said that to me. And I've asked them, so what have you tried to do about this? Oh, nothing. If you are having trouble sleeping, go see your doctor, try different things. In most cases, sleep can be improved. And in terms of the impact of sleep loss, it's absolutely devastating in terms of a lot of people. Now, in terms of suicide, which age groups do you think have the highest suicide rate in New Zealand?
Teenagers.
Not teenagers. So the biggest group is actually 85 plus. 85 plus, yeah. And a lot of them are men, and it's men that have lost a significant relationship that they've had for 20 or 30 years. I think this is a great place where Christian churches can play a huge role. That support that needs to be there, that's a really high risk. If you've had a relationship for so long, then you suddenly lose it. suddenly life doesn't seem worth living anymore. But I think there's a real opening there for a lot of Christian churches to offer support in that area. The second highest risk group is for the 45 to 65 age group, middle-aged men. The third highest is 17 to 25-year-olds. And unfortunately, we put all our money in New Zealand trying to prevent teen suicides in school, and they make up a tiny fraction of total suicides. And we wonder why the suicide stats are getting worse. We're not targeting the real risk groups. So it's really important that we look at that. One of the problems with the 85 group is they actually know what they're doing. There's not like one specific method, but they tend to know what they're doing, so they make sure they do it right. So I think that's where it's really important that we try and offer support for people. So, talk to pastors and celebrants and people like this, because they often ignore this age group, don't they? Yeah. They often, So, Okay, and breathe. Right, yep, perfect. Just a couple of other things I want to mention. The other thing that we're not very good at looking out for is psychosis. Some suicides are caused by psychosis, and psychosis is basically irrational thinking. So, people see voices that aren't there, they hear... see voices? They hear voices that aren't there, and they see people that aren't there. They might think they're being persecuted when no one's out to get them. And sadly, this is a real risk factor for suicide, but we're not very good at knowing what to do about it. Psychosis is a medical emergency. You cannot talk someone out of this. Now, we sometimes think that this can be drug-induced, like using pee and things like that. It can also be caused by several other things, particularly stress and lack of sleep.
So what do you do if you come across someone who's...
Ring 111. It's a medical emergency. You cannot talk someone out of it.
So ask for an ambulance?
Yeah, or the police. Yeah. They're a danger to themselves. Some people have a moderate level of psychosis, but if it's a full-blown psychotic episode, it's a medical emergency. Right, just quickly, we'll go through these ones. There's strong evidence that removing lethal means makes a big difference. So, for example, if someone's suicidal, getting guns out of the house and things like that makes a huge, huge difference. Okay, now you ask quickly, does talking about suicide help? We might assume that if someone's suicidal, then, hearing about the tragic loss of a young life, that'll talk them out of it. A woman in one of my seminars one day said to me, when I heard about my friend's suicide at school, I didn't feel sadness, I felt jealousy. And so sometimes talking about this in the wrong way gives people ideas. So absolutely talk about mental illness, absolutely talk about how to help someone in a bad situation, but talking about suicide can actually give people ideas. Right, I'm just going to, just because we're a little bit short on time. Right, some people say if we stop people doing it one way, then they'll just do it another way. Between 1937 and 1971, 500 people were stopped jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. Years later, the researchers followed them up, and they found that 94% were still alive or had died of natural causes. 94%. So in other words, if you can help someone at that time of crisis, they're not just going to go and do it another way or at another time. There's an exceptionally high chance that they will live. So suicide prevention does make a huge difference, and it is not inevitable. Right, in the last 3 minutes, hopefully. I said that a third to a half of all suicides are the result of a same-day crisis. I think one of the big reasons is, as a society, we don't talk about failure enough. We give too many people certificates of participation in school, and they don't know how to fail. And I mean this with all sincerity, it is killing people. So I actually encourage you to talk about your failures with people. I'll tell you a quick story. I humiliated myself on Britain's Got Talent about 6 years ago. It was a disaster. But when I talked to a group of people about this and I openly shared it, they said I was one of the most inspiring people they'd ever met. And I thought they were just trying to make me feel better. But what I realised, I told another group and I got the same reaction from them. But eventually what I figured out was that it wasn't so much the fact that I failed that they wanted to hear. It was the fact that I was openly sharing my failure. Because too many people think that if you fail, that's it, your life is ruined. And when we hide failure from people, it literally kills some people. So I encourage you to share your failures with people and let people know that this is not the end. Because I've met lots of people that have failed spectacularly and they thought there was no way out of this. There was no way it was ever going to be able to recover. But actually a couple of years later you talk to them, they're doing just fine. So don't be afraid to talk about failure. So many suicides are the result of losing a job, a relationship breakup, losing a whole lot of money very instantly. And I think maybe if more people knew that actually lots of people do dumb stuff. Happens all the time. But maybe if more people knew that, it wouldn't turn into the disaster of suicide. So that's all I have for you. Out the front, if you do want to buy copies of my book, they're $20 each. I've got a website, beingatruehero.com. On there I've got a whole lot of different talks on different mental health topics, how to help someone that's suicidal, anything like that. If you do want to ask me questions individually, I'm more than happy to stay around for a little bit. Other than that, I really appreciate you taking the time to come here today, learn about suicide, because the only way we're going to beat this is if people like you come out to talks like this. So thank you very much.